Have you ever been made to feel small, worthless, like a forgotten chapter in someone else's triumphant story? This isn't just a tale of revenge, it's a story about the quiet, unyielding power of self-worth. It begins in the glittering heart of high society at a gala where a man named Richard Sterling is holding court. He's a peacock in $1,000 suit, his voice booming as he brags about his life, his success, and the beautiful young woman on his arm. The subject of his cruelest jokes, the wife he discarded, Eleanor. He paints her as a pathetic, forgotten woman, but he's about to learn a lesson that no amount of money can buy. The past doesn't always stay buried, and sometimes it returns, not in a beat-up sedan, but in a custom Rolls-Royce with a billionaire at the wheel. The Oakwood Valley Country Club was a cathedral of old money and new ambition, and tonight, at its annual summer gala, Richard Sterling was preaching from the pulpit. He stood near the sprawling ice sculpture of a swan, a flute of champagne in one hand, and his other arm wrapped possessively around the waist of his fiancée, Tiffany Monroe. Tiffany was 24, with hair the color of spun gold and a smile that had been perfected for Instagram filters. She was in Richard's eyes the ultimate accessory, a testament to his post-divorce success. "Honestly, I feel like I've been reborn," Richard announced to a captive audience of fellow investment brokers and their immaculately preserved wives. His voice was a confident baritone that sliced through the polite chatter and the distant strains of a string quartet. "It's like I was driving a sensible, reliable Ford for 15 years. Utterly boring, you know. Did its job, got me from A to B, but zero excitement. Then I traded it in for a Ferrari. Sleek, powerful, turns every head on the street." He squeezed Tiffany's waist, and she giggled, a sound like tiny bells. "No offense, darling." "None taken, babe," Tiffany cooed, tilting her head. "I love being your Ferrari." The group chuckled, but a few of the older wives exchanged tight-lipped glances. They remembered Eleanor. They remembered the quiet grace she brought to these events, the intelligence in her eyes that Richard had always seemed so eager to dim. "What's old Eleanor up to these days, anyway?" asked a portly man named Robert Croft, Richard's senior partner. Richard took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne. He loved this question. It was the setup for his favorite punchline. "Eleanor, oh God. Last I heard, she's renting some shoebox apartment downtown. You know that little design hobby she had? The sketches and fabric swatches all over the dining room table. She's trying to make a go of it. Eleanor Vance Interiors, or some such nonsense." He let out a short, sharp laugh. "Can you imagine from this?" He gestured around the opulent ballroom to picking out throw pillows for middle-class housewives in the suburbs. "It's tragic, really." He leaned in conspiratorially. "I was generous in the divorce, of course. A man of my stature has to be. But she was proud. 'I don't want your money, Richard,' she said." He mimicked her voice, pitching it high and reedy. "I want to make it on my own. Noble, I suppose, in a pathetic sort of way. I give her 6 months before she comes crawling back, begging for a top-up on her alimony." The truth, however, was a far uglier story. The 15 years with Richard hadn't been a sensible Ford. They had been a gilded quatorze. Eleanor had met him in college. He was ambitious and charming. She was bright, creative, and saw a future she thought they could build together. She put her own architectural aspirations on hold to support his budding career in finance. She hosted the dinner parties, remembered the clients' birthdays, and cultivated the social connections that were so vital to his ascent. Her silly little hobby was in fact a deep-seated passion for architectural and interior design. Her notebooks weren't filled with doodles, they were filled with detailed floor plans, innovative material concepts, and sketches of sustainable, human-centric living spaces. Whenever she tried to show him, he would wave a dismissive hand. "That's nice, honey." He'd say, his eyes glued to the stock market ticker on his phone. "But let's leave the building to the big boys, eh? Why don't you focus on the guest list for the fundraiser?" The belittling was subtle at first, 1,000 tiny cuts. He'd helpfully suggest a different dress for a party because hers wasn't quite right. He'd correct her in front of friends when she spoke about politics or finance, framing it as a gentle lesson. He'd call her design work cute, a word that felt like a slap. He controlled the finances with an iron fist, giving her an allowance as if she were a child, despite their wealth being built on the foundation of her social and emotional labor. The breaking point wasn't a single event, but a slow, dawning horror. She was 40 years old, looking in the mirror one morning, and saw a stranger. The spark in her eyes was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. She was a ghost in her own home, a beautifully dressed manager of Richard Sterling's life. That afternoon, while he was at the club, she found one of his burner phones. It was filled with messages to a 22-year-old intern, a girl who would later be replaced by Tiffany. But it wasn't even the affair that broke her. It was the realization that he was utterly incapable of seeing her as an equal, as a person, with a mind and a soul of her own. Leaving was the hardest thing she had ever done. He had been vicious. "You'll be nothing without me," he'd screamed, his handsome face contorted with rage. "You're throwing away a perfect life because you want to play with crayons." She refused the opulent house, the cuz, and the blood money he called alimony. She took only what she had come with her personal savings from before the marriage, her clothes, and her notebooks full of dreams. The world he painted for his friends of a proud, foolish woman was a carefully constructed fiction to mask the truth. She hadn't just left him. She had escaped him. And in that shoebox apartment downtown, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the lingering smell of fear and freedom, Eleanor Vance wasn't picking out throw pillows. She was hunched over a drafting table, the glow of her laptop illuminating a set of blueprints, so audacious, so revolutionary, that they would have made Richard Sterling's world look like a child's sandcastle. She wasn't crawling, she was building. The first 6 months were brutal. The shoebox apartment felt less like a fresh start and more like a prison cell on some days. The hum of the old refrigerator was a constant companion, a stark contrast to the cathedral-like silence of her former home. Every creak of the floorboards in the apartment above was a reminder of how far she had fallen in the eyes of the world she'd left behind. Eleanor poured what little savings she had into starting her business. She built a simple, elegant website showcasing her student portfolio and a few conceptual projects she'd designed in her spare time. She called herself Vance Design Studios, dropping the Eleanor to sound more like a firm and less like a lone, desperate woman. The rejections came swiftly. Established firms saw her as a housewife with a hobby. Potential clients in Richard's circle, whom she tried to contact, either ghosted her or politely declined, no doubt, after a warning call from her ex-husband. She took on tiny, soul-crushing jobs to pay the rent, helping a family pick out paint colors for their nursery, advising on new curtains for a dentist's waiting room. Richard's mocking words echoed in her ears on the lonely bus rides home, picking out throw pillows for middle-class housewives. She was on the verge of admitting defeat, of taking a retail job at a furniture store when the email arrived. It was terse professional and came from an address she didn't recognize as est.finch at Viridian Dynamics. Com. Subject design consultation. Ms. Vance. Mr. Alastair Finch has reviewed your conceptual work online, specifically the Elysian project. He requests a consultation to discuss the design of a private study and library. An NDA will be required prior to the meeting. Please advise on your availability. Regards, Catherine, Executive Assistant to Alastair Finch. Eleanor stared at the name. Alastair Finch. She had to Google it. The results made her heart hammer against her ribs. Alastair Finch wasn't just wealthy. He was a titan, a visionary tech billionaire who had made his fortune in sustainable energy and then pivoted into revolutionary architectural development through his company, Viridian Dynamics. He was notoriously private, a recluse who hadn't been photographed publicly in years. His projects were the stuff of legend, self-sustaining corporate campuses, eco-friendly residential towers that purified the air around them. He had seen her Elysium project, a conceptual design she had created years ago, a dream of a home that lived in harmony with its environment, using geothermal heating, passive solar design, and recycled materials. Richard had glanced at the sketches once and laughed. Looks like a glorified hobbit hole L. Who would pay for that? Apparently, Alistair Finch would. The meeting was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't in a stuffy boardroom. She was driven by a silent chauffeur to a discreet address on the coast, a modern but unassuming house cantilevered over the Pacific. There was no sign on the gate, no ostentatious display of wealth. Alistair Finch was waiting for her, not in a suit, but in a simple grey cashmere sweater and jeans. He was older than her, perhaps in his early 50s, with kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through the nervous facade she had erected. There was a quiet intensity about him, a stillness that was the polar opposite of Richard's performative bluster. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice calm and warm. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the secrecy. I value my privacy." He gestured for her to sit, not across a desk, but in one of two comfortable armchairs by a window overlooking the churning ocean. "Your Elysian concept," he began, getting straight to the point. "It's not just design, it's a philosophy. You understand that a space should not just be inhabited, but experienced. That it should serve the person, not the other way around." For 2 hours, they didn't talk about fabrics or furniture. They talked about light and shadow, about the psychology of space, about the flow of energy through a home. He listened, truly listened, as she explained her ideas, his gaze never leaving her face. He asked insightful questions, challenging her, pushing her, treating her not as a decorator, but as a fellow creator. For the first time in 15 years, Eleanor felt seen. She got the job, of course. The study was a test. She passed with flying colors, creating a space that was both a sanctuary and a powerhouse of creativity, perfectly reflecting the man himself. One project led to another, a guest house, a complete redesign of a corporate retreat in the mountains. He paid her invoices promptly and generously, but it was his mentorship that was the real currency. He gave her access to his resources, introduced her to cutting-edge material scientists and engineers, and championed her vision. Under his quiet patronage, Vance Design Studios flourished. She hired a small, brilliant team. They moved from the shoebox apartment to a sleek, minimalist office downtown. Her name began to be whispered in elite architectural circles, a rising star with a fresh, sustainable vision. Their professional relationship slowly, naturally blossomed into something more. It began with late-night work sessions, turning into long dinners, conversations, shifting from blueprints to life, to dreams, to the scars they both carried from their pasts. He was a widower, his wife having passed away years ago, and he spoke of her with a gentle reverence that made Eleanor's heart ache for the respect she had never known with Richard. Alistair was drawn to her resilience, her fierce intellect, and the passion that Richard had tried so hard to extinguish. Eleanor, in turn, found in him a safe harbour. He wasn't her saviour, he was her partner. His wealth was incidental to the man. He was kind, respectful, and genuinely in awe of her talent. He didn't want to dim her light. He wanted to build a bigger stage for it. "You know," he said one evening, as they stood on the balcony of her newly completed mountain project, the stars, brilliant in the clear night sky. "I'm on the board of the Oakwood Valley Preservation Society. Their annual gala is next week. It's usually a dreadful affair, but I feel obligated to go." He turned to her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I was wondering if you might do me the honor of accompanying me." Eleanor's blood ran cold for a second. The Oakwood Gala, Richard's kingdom, the stage for her annual humiliation, the thought of walking in there. Then she looked at Alistair's face, at the unwavering respect in his eyes. She thought of her team, her successful projects, the woman she had become. She was no longer the ghost of Richard Sterling's wife. She was Eleanor Vance. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. I'd love to, Alistair. I think it's time I revisited my old stomping grounds. The air in the Oakwood Valley ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and self-congratulation. Richard Sterling was in his element, the center of a rapt circle, his voice rising and falling with practiced cadence as he regaled them with the story of his life's brilliant second act. It's all about trading up, he declared, giving Tiffany's arm a proprietary squeeze. In business, in life, you have to be ruthless. Cut your losses. Eleanor, bless her heart, she was a loss. A comfortable one for a while, but she lacked vision. She couldn't see the big picture. Robert Croft, his boss, nodded sagely, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. A man needs a woman who inspires him to reach greater heights, not one who wants to retile the bathroom. The men around them brayed with laughter. Tiffany preened, basking in the reflected glory of her man the visionary. She ran a hand down his lapel. My baby is building an empire, she said, her voice breathy. Tell them about the North Ridge project, honey. Richard's chest puffed out. This was his masterstroke. Ah, yes, North Ridge. Sterling and Croft is finalizing the deal on a massive parcel of land just north of the city. We're going to build the most exclusive luxury housing development this state has ever seen. Think gated community, but on a whole other level. Private golf course, equestrian center. We're talking legacy. He lowered his voice, making it sound like a state secret. We're days away from closing. It's going to put us on the map permanently.
Ali,
And he conveniently left out the part where the financing was stretched to its absolute limit, that the deal was precariously balanced on a knife's edge, and that his personal finances were deeply entangled with the project's success. To his audience, he was a king surveying his domain. It was precisely at that moment that the low murmur of the crowd near the grand entrance began to change. The polite chatter faltered, replaced by a wave of shushed whispers and craned necks. A ripple of silence spread through the ballroom as if a switch had been flipped. Richard, annoyed at having his spotlight stolen, turned his head. What's all the fuss about? He grumbled. Through the grand archway, framed like a masterpiece, a scene was unfolding that defied belief. A long, impossibly sleek, custom-built Rolls-Royce Phantom, a shade of deep midnight blue, that seemed to drink the light, had just purred to a stop. This wasn't the standard Mercedes or BMW that littered the club's valet line. This was a car that whispered, not shouted, its owner's status. A uniformed chauffeur opened the rear door. A single, elegant, high-heeled shoe, crafted from emerald green satin, emerged first, followed by a slender leg. Then a woman stood up and turned towards the entrance, and a collective gasp swept up the room. It was Eleanor, but it wasn't the Eleanor they remembered. The timid, tastefully beige wife of Richard Sterling was gone. This woman was a vision. She wore a floor-length gown of liquid silver silk that clung to her form, its simple architectural lines speaking of a confidence that needed no frills or ruffles. Her hair, once kept in a sensible bob, was now a cascade of rich auburn waves swept over one shoulder. A simple but breathtaking necklace of emeralds and diamonds rested at her throat, echoing the color of her shoes. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly serene. Richard's jaw went slack. His champagne flute tilted a few drops, spilling onto the polished floor. Tiffany's perfectly applied smile froze and then tightened her eyes, narrowing, as she took in the woman who was supposed to be a pathetic frump. My God, Robert Croft breathed his eyes wide. Is that... But the true shock was yet to come. As Eleanor paused at the threshold, allowing the room to take her in, a man emerged from the other side of the Rolls-Royce. He was tall and distinguished, his bespoke charcoal suit fitting him like a second skin. He moved with an understated authority that made every other man in the room, including Richard, suddenly look like a boy playing dress-up. He came to Eleanor's side, offered her his arm, and they walked into the ballroom together. The whispers in the room erupted into a flurry of frantic murmurs. "That's Alistair Finch." "No, it can't be. He never comes to these things." "It is him. I saw a picture of him in Forbes." "What is he doing here with her?" Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Alistair Finch, the reclusive, untouchable demigod of tech and development, the man whose net worth was so vast that Richard's entire empire wouldn't even qualify as a rounding error. And he was here with Eleanor on his arm, looking at her, not like a trophy, but with an expression of profound admiration and affection. They moved through the crowd, which parted for them like the Red Sea. They weren't seeking attention yet, they commanded it completely. The alpha energy had shifted in the room, moving from Richard's loud, fragile ego to the quiet, unshakable presence of the man beside his ex-wife. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, calm and cool. They swept past the stunned faces of the women who had pitied her, the men who had dismissed her. Finally, her gaze landed on Richard. She didn't glare or smirk. She simply met his eyes with a look of cool, distant recognition, the look one might give a piece of furniture from a life long past. And in that single, devastatingly neutral glance, Richard Sterling felt himself shrink. His $1,000 suit suddenly felt cheap. His boasts about Ferraris and empires turned to ash in his mouth, and the beautiful young woman clinging to his arm felt less like a prize and more like a consolation trophy. The Queen had returned to the board, and he was just a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. The universe seemed to bend around Eleanor and Alistair as they glided towards the center of the room. The string quartet, as if on cue, swelled into a more dramatic piece. People didn't know whether to stare or look away. Richard, rooted to the spot, felt a cold sweat prickle his brow. His carefully constructed reality was fracturing before his very eyes. Tiffany was the first to break the spell of silence in their small group. "Who is that old guy?" she hissed, her voice sharp with insecurity. "And what did she do to her hair?" Richard didn't answer. He was watching his ex-wife, the woman he had called boring and visionless, move with the poise of royalty. He watched as the club president, a man who usually only gave Richard a cursory nod, rushed over to greet Alistair Finch with a fawning deference that was almost painful to watch. Driven by a toxic cocktail of disbelief and wounded pride, Richard knew he couldn't just stand there. To do nothing would be to admit defeat. He had to regain control of the narrative. He straightened his tie, plastered a wide, predatory smile on his face, and began to stride towards them, dragging a reluctant Tiffany behind him. "Well, well, well," Richard boomed, forcing a jovial tone as he intercepted them near the bar. "Eleanor, I almost didn't recognize you. You clean up nicely." It was meant to be a backhanded compliment, a reassertion of his dominance. Eleanor turned to face him. Her expression was placid, betraying nothing. "Richard," she said, her voice even and calm. It held none of the hurt or anger he expected. It held nothing at all for him, and that was somehow worse. Alistair Finch turned his gaze on Richard, and for the first time Richard felt the full force of the man's presence. Alistair's eyes weren't hostile, they were analytical, like a scientist studying a particularly uninteresting insect. "Richard, I'd like you to meet Alistair Finch," Eleanor said smoothly. "Alistair, this is my ex-husband, Richard Sterling." Richard puffed out his chest and extended a hand. "Richard Sterling, Sterling and Croft. A pleasure. Big admirer of your work, Mr. Finch. We're in development as well, though on a more grounded scale." He laughed, a hollow, booming sound. Alistair took his hand in a firm, brief grip. His hand was warm, his grip effortless but solid. "Sterling," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying immense weight. "I'm not familiar with your firm." It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed like a punch to the gut. Richard's firm was his identity, his pride. To the most important man in the industry, it didn't even exist. Richard's smile faltered. And this, Richard said, recovering quickly and pulling Tiffany forward, is my fiancée, Tiffany Monroe. Tiffany offered a flirty little wave. Hi, love your car. Alistair gave her a polite, fleeting nod before his attention returned fully to Eleanor. Eleanor, would you care for a drink? I believe they have that sparkling water from the Italian Alps you enjoy. The casual intimacy of the comment was another blow. He knew her preferences. Richard, after 15 years of marriage, could barely remember if she took sugar in her coffee. He felt a hot flush of jealousy that was as surprising as it was intense. So, Eleanor, Richard pressed on, unable to let it go. What's the story? Did you win the lottery? He gestured between her and Alistair. Or did you finally find someone to bankroll your little design hobby? The insult hung in the air, crude and obvious. Several people nearby who had been shamelessly eavesdropping winced. Tiffany smirked, sensing her fiancé was back on the offensive. This time it was Eleanor who laughed. It wasn't the bitter laugh he expected. It was a light, genuinely amused sound. Bankroll, she repeated, a small smile playing on her lips. She turned to Alistair. Did you hear that, darling? He thinks you're my financier. Alistair's expression remained impassive, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. Richard, he said, his voice dropping half an octave, becoming steelier. I am not Eleanor's financier. I am her biggest client, and more importantly, I am her partner. Vance Design Studios is the lead architectural and design firm for Viridian Dynamics' new Terra initiative. The name dropped into the conversation like a 10-ton weight. The Terra initiative was the most talked about, most secretive, and most ambitious project on the planet. A plan to build a series of fully self-sustaining carbon-negative cities. It was the future of architecture, and Eleanor, the woman he'd mocked for her Hobbit Hole sketches, was the lead designer. Robert Croft, who had sidled up behind Richard, made a choking sound. Vance Design. Your ex-wife is Vance Design, he whispered hoarsely to Richard. Richard's mind reeled. The whispers he'd heard about a mysterious genius firm called Vance Design. He had assumed it was some established German or Scandinavian company. He never, not in a million years, would have connected it to her. Eleanor looked directly at Richard, her eyes clear and strong. My little hobby, as you used to call it, is currently managing a project portfolio worth several $billion, Richard. It turns out some people appreciate vision. And she didn't say it with malice, but with a simple, devastating finality. The foundation of Richard's world was not just cracking, it was turning to dust. He had built his entire identity on the belief that he was the successful one, the visionary, and she was the failure. In the space of 5 minutes, that entire narrative had been inverted. He was a small-time developer, hustling for a land deal. She was shaping the future of cities. He looked desperately at Tiffany, seeking an ally, but her face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. The man she'd attached herself to, the one she thought was a titan, was being effortlessly dwarfed. Her Ferrari was suddenly looking like a beat-up used car next to Eleanor's rocket ship. Richard opened his mouth to say something, anything to save face, but no words came out. He was completely and utterly undone. And the worst part was the night wasn't over. The true devastation was still to come. Just as Richard was floundering, searching for a lifeline in a sea of his own, making a new sound cut through the ballroom's hushed atmosphere. It wasn't music or chatter, but the coordinated chime of dozens of smartphones. A wave of notifications rippled through the gala as guests pulled out their devices, their faces illuminated by the screens. Robert Croft's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. He pulled it out, his brow furrowed with irritation, which quickly morphed into stark disbelief. His eyes widened, and he stared at his screen, then at Alistair Finch, then at Richard. Richard, Robert whispered, his voice trembling slightly. It's a press release from Viridian Dynamics. Richard, felt a knot of pure dread tighten in his stomach. He fumbled for his own phone, his fingers suddenly clumsy. He brought up the news alert, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. For immediate release, Viridian Dynamics acquires Northridge property for Phase 1 of Terra Initiative. The headline swam before his eyes. He read it again, and then a third time, the words refusing to make sense. Northridge. His Northridge. The land deal that was supposed to be his legacy, the cornerstone of his entire professional life. The press release went on, quoting Alastair Finch. The 10,000-acre Northridge parcel represents a unique opportunity. Its topography and natural resources make it the ideal location for the first fully integrated Terra community, a blueprint for sustainable living for the 21st century. We are excited to break ground in the coming months. Richard looked up from his phone, his face pale and slack with shock. He stared at Alastair, then at Eleanor. How? He croaked, the single word barely audible. We were in final negotiations. We had the inside track. The deal was supposed to close next week. Alastair Finch took a sip of his water, his composure absolute. He looked at Richard with an expression that was almost pitying. You were in negotiations with the Landowners Consortium, Richard, a group of families who have owned that land for generations. You offered them money. You saw the land as a commodity, a blank slate for you to build your gaudy McMansions. He gestured with his glass towards Eleanor, a gesture of profound respect. Eleanor saw it differently. She didn't see a blank slate. She saw a complex ecosystem. She spent months walking that land, studying the watershed, the migratory bird patterns, the old-growth forests. She didn't present the consortium with a lowball offer and a tacky artist's rendering. She presented them with a vision. Eleanor spoke, then her voice steady and clear, cutting through Richard's fog of confusion. They didn't want to just sell their heritage, Richard. They wanted to see it preserved and honored. I showed them how we could build within the landscape, not on top of it. How we could use geothermal energy from the natural hot springs you never bothered to survey. How a research and education center dedicated to the local ecology could be funded by the project, employing their children and grandchildren for generations. I showed them a future. You showed them a subdivision. The full, horrifying picture began to assemble itself in Richard's mind. While he had been whining and dining, investors boasting about his impending triumph, Eleanor had been quietly, intelligently, and methodically dismantling it from the ground up. She had used the very skills he'd ridiculed: her eye for detail, her understanding of space and environment, her silly hobby, to outmaneuver him on the biggest deal of his life. Viridian Dynamics didn't just offer them more money. Alastair continued, his voice as sharp and final as a judge's gavel. We offered them a partnership and a legacy they could be proud of. They signed the exclusive sale agreement with us yesterday afternoon. The deal was funded and closed this morning. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Your bid was never even a serious contender. They were just using you to gauge the market rate. Humiliation washed over Richard in a sickening wave. He hadn't just been beaten, he had been played. He was a fool, a pawn in a game so far above his level that he hadn't even seen the board. Robert Croft grabbed Richard's arm, his fingers digging in like talons. Our primary investors, our credit lines, everything was leveraged against this deal, Richard. He hissed, his face purple with rage. We're ruined. The firm is ruined. Richard stumbled back away from the accusation in his partner's eyes, away from the pity in Alastair's, away from the serene, unassailable strength on Eleanor's face. He looked at Tiffany, and for the first time he saw her clearly. Her face was a mask of cold calculation. The adoration was gone, replaced by a frantic assessment of her own situation. She was looking at him, not as her fiancé, but as a bad investment. A stock that had just crashed to zero. The final piece of his world crumbled. It wasn't just his business that was gone. It was the entire flimsy facade. The crowd was now openly staring their whispers, no longer hushed but buzzing with the delicious, brutal gossip of his spectacular downfall. He was no longer the king of the gala. He was the court jester, stripped bare in the center of the room, his own arrogance the instrument of his destruction. The rest of the gala was a blur of muted colors and distorted sounds for Richard. He felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, not with admiration, but with a morbid curiosity reserved for car crashes. Robert Croft had already abandoned him, huddling in a corner with other board members, their faces grim as they frantically tapped on their phones, no doubt trying to assess the scale of the damage. Tiffany detached her hand from his arm. I think I need some air, she mumbled, not looking at him. She didn't walk. She fled, disappearing into the crowd, a golden retriever abandoning a sinking ship. Richard knew, with a certainty, that chilled him to the bone, that he would never see her again, except perhaps in the tabloids with her next benefactor. He was alone, utterly and completely alone in the wreckage of his own making. Across the room, Eleanor and Alistair didn't gloat. There was no triumphant toast, no pointed glances in his direction. After speaking briefly with a few other guests, who now approached them with a newfound reverence, they simply turned and walked towards the exit, their departure as graceful and understated as their arrival. They hadn't come for revenge. Revenge was beneath them. They had come to attend a gala, conduct a piece of business, and continue with their lives that had simply and consequentially eclipsed his. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the scent of jasmine from the club's gardens filled Eleanor's senses. The chaos of the ballroom felt a world away. The chauffeur held the door of the Rolls-Royce open for them. Inside the car was a cocoon of silence and luxury. The city lights slid past the windows as they pulled away from the country club, leaving the ruin of Richard's life behind them. Eleanor let out a long, slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wasn't giddy or triumphant. She felt calm. The final chain linking her to her past, a chain of insecurity and self-doubt that Richard had forged, had finally been broken. Alistair reached over and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She turned to him, a genuine, unburdened smile gracing her lips for the first time that night. "I am," she said, "better than all right. Thank you, Alistair, for believing in me." "Eleanor," he said, his expression serious, "I want to be very clear. I didn't do any of this for you. I did it with you. The North Ridge vision was entirely yours. Your intelligence, your empathy, your unique perspective, that is what won that deal. I just provided the capital to make it a reality. This victory is yours, and yours alone." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of release. He saw her. He truly saw her, not as an extension of himself or as someone to be saved, but as a brilliant and capable partner. "So," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she squeezed his hand, "what's next for Vance Design Studios and Viridian Dynamics?" Alistair smiled, his eyes lighting up with the familiar spark of enthusiasm she had come to love. "I was looking at that satellite imagery of the Atacama Desert you sent me," he began. "Your concept for harvesting atmospheric moisture for the cooling systems. I think it's time we started sketching out phase 2. As the limousine sped them towards a future of their own design, a future filled with innovation, respect, and shared purpose. Richard Sterling stood frozen in the club's parking lot. His valet had brought his car around a gleaming red Maserati he'd bought to impress Tiffany. Now it just looked garish and pathetic. He had traded in a life of substance for one of style, and now he had neither. He had everything he thought he ever wanted, and in the end it amounted to nothing at all. He got into the car, the engine roaring to life with a hollow promise of power, and drove off into a future he had never planned for one where he was completely and irrevocably irrelevant. 3 weeks after the gala, the autumn air turned crisp, stripping the leaves from the oak trees that lined Richard Sterling's once prestigious street. The change in season was a fitting metaphor for his own life, which had been stripped bare with a brutal, astonishing speed. The red Maserati was gone, repossessed by a finance company that was unsympathetic to his sudden financial ruin. His house, a cavernous testament to his former ego, was now an echo chamber of failure. For sale signs dotted the manicured lawn like tombstones. The dissolution of Sterling and Croft had been a bloodbath. When the Northridge deal collapsed, it triggered a cascade of covenant breaches on their loans. The firm leveraged to the hilt folded in less than a week. Robert Croft, in a masterful act of self-preservation, had painted Richard as a reckless, egotistical rogue operator in his depositions, sacrificing his junior partner to the horde of furious investors. Lawsuits were piling up, each one a paper and ink monument to his hubris. He now spent his days in a rented, soul-crushingly beige office above a laundromat, the scent of fabric softener, a constant, cloying reminder of his new station. He wasn't building empires anymore. He was fielding calls from bankruptcy lawyers and negotiating settlements with creditors who wanted their pound of flesh. His former friends from the country club no longer answered his calls. He had been excommunicated from the world that had once worshipped him. His evenings were the worst. Alone in the echoing house with takeout boxes for company, he would torture himself by searching the internet. Tiffany had wasted no time. She was already being photographed on the arm of a German industrialist, looking radiant on a yacht in Monaco. The gossip columns dubbed her a survivor, a woman who had narrowly escaped the clutches of a disgraced financier. The irony was a bitter pill he was forced to swallow every night. But his most obsessive searches were for two names, Eleanor Vance and Alastair Finch. They were everywhere. Forbes ran a cover story titled The Visionaries, featuring a stunning photograph of them standing on a windswept hill, blueprints in hand. The article wasn't about their romance. It was about their professional synergy, hailing Vance Design Studios as the most disruptive force in architecture in a generation. Architectural Digest did a 10-page spread on Eleanor's design philosophy, showcasing her past projects and the breathtaking initial concepts for the terror community at Northridge. They called her style empathetic architecture, a term that made Richard sneer, even as a part of him felt a grudging pang of understanding. One Tuesday morning, he saw an announcement for a groundbreaking ceremony at the Northridge site. It was a private event for investors and press only. An image accompanied the article, Eleanor in a hard hat and practical boots, laughing with a group of engineers, her face alight with genuine passion. She looked younger, more vibrant and more confident than he had ever seen her. She was in her element, not as a hostess or a wife, but as a creator, a leader. Seeing her like that so thoroughly, her own person was a deeper wound than losing his company or his fortune. He had possessed the frame, but he had never once understood the masterpiece within it. A desperate, irrational idea began to form in his mind. He needed to see her. Not to beg or apologize, his pride wouldn't allow it. He needed to see if the woman in those photographs was real. He needed to puncture the myth to find a crack in her new, perfect life. He needed to believe that somewhere underneath the success and the billionaire was the quiet, pliable Eleanor he had once controlled. He found out from a small local blog that she frequented a particular artisan coffee shop in a trendy, revitalized neighborhood downtown, not far from her new offices. It was the kind of place he'd once mocked all reclaimed wood and single-origin beans. Now it felt like enemy territory. He waited for 2 days, sitting in his sensible second-hand sedan across the street, feeling like a private detective in a cheap novel. On the third day, he saw her. She arrived not in a Rolls-Royce, but in a modest electric car, and she was alone. She wore simple black trousers, a soft cashmere sweater, and her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail. She looked like any other successful professional, grabbing her morning coffee. He took a deep breath, got out of his car, and walked in. The bell above the door chimed, and her head lifted from the laptop she had open on a small table. Her eyes met his. There was a flicker of surprise, nothing more. No fear, no anger. It was the calm, distant recognition of a near stranger. "Richard," she said, her voice even. She didn't invite him to sit. "Eleanor." He began trying to summon his old, easy charm. It felt like a poorly fitting suit. "Fancy meeting you here. This is, your new spot." "Sometimes," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I have a meeting nearby." The message was clear. "I'm busy. Don't waste my time." He gestured vaguely at her laptop. "So, this is it. The big headquarters of Vance Design. A coffee shop." He meant it as a light-hearted jab, an echo of their old dynamic, but it landed with a thud. "My office is 3 blocks away, Richard. It has 30 employees and a view of the entire city. This," she said, tapping her laptop, "is where I come to think. You'll recall I was never allowed a space to do that in the house we shared." The directness of the blow caught him off guard. The older Eleanor would have absorbed the barb, offered a placating smile. This Eleanor returned it sharpened and precise. He floundered, changing tactics. "Look, Elle, what happened? With the firm, with everything. It was a disaster. I'm ruined." He laid his vulnerability bare, hoping to elicit a spark of the sympathy she had once given him so freely. She looked at him, her head tilted slightly, an expression of clinical assessment on her face. "Yes," she said. "I read about it. It sounded difficult." Difficult. The word was so mild, so detached, it was more insulting than any curse. It was the word one would use to describe a puzzle, not a man's complete and utter ruin. He realized with a sinking heart that she felt nothing for his plight. He was a headline she had skimmed. A desperate, ugly anger began to bubble up inside him. "You did this," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You and your billionaire boyfriend. You set out to destroy me." Eleanor closed her laptop with a soft final click. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of emotion in her eyes. It wasn't anger, it was pity. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice soft but firm. "This was never about you, Richard. North Ridge wasn't a weapon to use against you. It was a project I believed in. Alistair's involvement wasn't a plot to ruin you. It was a partnership born from mutual respect for a vision. You were a business obstacle, nothing more. Your ruin wasn't the goal. It was an incidental consequence of your own poor business practices and your profound underestimation of the market. And of me." She stood up, slinging her bag over her shoulder. She was preparing to leave. He was being dismissed. "You couldn't have done it without his money." He spat, his last desperate gambit. "Don't pretend you're some self-made genius. He bought you this new life." Eleanor paused and looked at him one last time. There was no pity left in her eyes now, only a clear, cold finality. "Alistair's money was the amplifier, Richard," she said, her words striking him like stones. "But the idea, the vision, the design, that was the signal. You lived with the source of that signal for 15 years. You had every opportunity to listen, to engage, to collaborate. But you chose to turn it off, to mock it, to tell it that it was just a silly little hobby. You can't blame the man who finally thought the signal was worth amplifying." She turned and walked away without another word. Through the coffee shop window, Richard watched as Alistair Finch pulled up to the curb. He wasn't driving the Rolls-Royce, but a simple, dark Tesla. He got out, opened the passenger door for Eleanor, and greeted her with a warm, loving smile. They exchanged a few words, and she laughed a sound Richard couldn't hear, but could feel in his bones, a laugh of pure, unadulterated happiness. They drove away, merging into the city traffic, moving on to their future. Richard Sterling remained standing in the middle of the coffee shop, his own coffee growing cold on a distant table. He was finally completely alone with the truth he hadn't been destroyed by his ex-wife's revenge or a billionaire's power. He had been rendered obsolete by his own blindness. He was a ghost from a life that no longer existed, haunting a world that had already forgotten his name. Eleanor's story is a powerful reminder that true value is never determined by someone else's opinion. Richard saw her as a forgotten accessory, but he failed to see the architect of her own destiny hiding in plain sight. Her success wasn't about revenge. It was the natural outcome of reclaiming her power, her talent, and her self-worth. It's a testament to the fact that the most powerful empires are not built on money or ego, but on vision, integrity, and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. She didn't need to tear him down. She just needed to build her own world so high that his became an insignificant speck below. What did you think of Eleanor's incredible journey? Have you ever felt underestimated in your own life? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We love hearing from you. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas and stories of triumph. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update.
Have you ever wondered what happens after the storybook ending crumbles? For 15 years, Sophia Reynolds believed she had it all: a loving husband, a beautiful home, a life built on shared dreams. But one rainy Tuesday, her husband Julian shattered that reality. He was leaving her for a younger woman from his office, a woman with more ambition and less history. Julian traded their comfortable life for a future of passion and excitement, leaving Sophia with nothing but memories and a broken heart. He thought he was upgrading. He thought he'd never look back. But 5 years later, at the most exclusive charity gala of the year, he saw her again. And the man who threw everything away suddenly found himself with nothing to say. The scent of roasted rosemary and garlic chicken, Julian's favorite, did little to warm the sterile silence of their dining room. Sophia Reynolds had spent the better part of the afternoon perfecting the meal, a subconscious peace offering for a war she didn't realize had already been lost. 15 years of marriage had taught her the rhythms of Julian Vance's moods. The slight clench in his jaw, the way his eyes would scan a room without ever truly seeing it. The perfunctory kiss he'd place on her cheek when he came home from the architectural firm, smelling of expensive cologne and a faint, unplaceable distance. Tonight, all the warning signs were blaring. Their home in the Boston suburbs, a meticulously restored Victorian they had once poured their hearts and savings into, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a museum of a life that was once vibrant. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed a younger, happier couple grinning on a gondola in Venice, bundled in ski gear in Aspen, their arms wrapped around each other at a company picnic just a few years prior. Looking at them now felt like observing the fossilized remains of an extinct species. "The Henderson project is proving to be a nightmare," Julian said, pushing a perfectly roasted potato around his plate with his fork. It was the first thing he'd said in 10 minutes. His voice, once the sound that could soothe any of her anxieties, now felt like a stranger's. "Oh, what's the issue?" Sophia asked, her own fork frozen mid-air. She tried to infuse her tone with genuine interest, the wifely duty she had perfected over a decade and a half. She had set aside her own promising career as an art historian to support his ascent at Sterling and Vance Architects, a sacrifice she had made willingly, believing they were a team. "It's Chloe," he sighed, and the way he said the name, a soft, almost involuntary caress of the syllables, sent a sliver of ice down Sophia's spine. Chloe Summers, the new junior architect. Young, raven-haired, with a predatory ambition that Sophia had clocked from the moment she'd met her at the last company holiday party. Chloe had hung on Julian's every word, her laughter a little too loud, her touch on his arm lingering a fraction of a second too long. Sophia had dismissed it as the naivete of a subordinate trying to impress the boss. She had been a fool. "She's just so driven." Julian continued, oblivious to the sudden chill in the room. "She has these radical ideas for the atrium that the board thinks are too risky, but I see the genius in them. She's not afraid to break the rules." The unspoken addendum hung heavy in the air, unlike you. Sophia felt the familiar bitter sting. For years, Julian's compliments had become backhanded critiques. Her steady, thoughtful nature was now unadventurous. Her love for their quiet life was stagnation. Her loyalty was predictability. He was painting her in shades of beige, while apparently this Chloe was a supernova of vibrant color. Well, sometimes rules are there for a reason, Julian. To prevent costly mistakes. Sophia said, her voice tighter than she intended. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes were cold. That's the difference between us, Sophia. You see rules. She sees possibilities. You see a fence. She sees a horizon. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was using his professional life as a metaphor to assassinate their personal one. Each word was a calculated blow designed to make her feel small, antiquated, and utterly insufficient. She put her fork down, her appetite completely gone. The delicious meal she had prepared now felt like ashes in her mouth. "What is this really about, Julian?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question felt momentous, like pushing a loose rock at the edge of a cliff. She knew with a dreadful certainty that an avalanche was coming. He took a long, slow sip of his Cabernet, his gaze unwavering. He didn't flinch. He didn't have the decency to look ashamed. He looked relieved, as if he had been waiting for her to finally ask the question he didn't have the courage to voice first. "I'm leaving you, Sophia," he said. The words were simple, declarative, and utterly devastating. They landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow knocking the air from her lungs. "You're... what?" She heard the words come out of her mouth, but they sounded distant, foreign. A ringing started in her ears. "I've found someone else," he continued, his voice gaining a chilling resolve. "I've found life again. Passion. I've been dead for years and I didn't even know it." "Dead," she echoed, her heart fracturing with each syllable. "We built a life together. This house, our friends, our history. Was all of that death to you?" "It was comfortable," he corrected, as if that were the most damning word in the dictionary. "It was predictable. I need more. Chloe, she offers more. She sees the man I can be, not the man I've settled into being. The name again. Chloe. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a wrecking ball. The affair hadn't just been in her imagination. It had been happening under her nose in the late nights at the office he claimed were for deadlines in the business trips that had become more frequent. She felt a wave of nausea. "So, you're just throwing it all away?" 15 years. For a junior architect who has been at the firm for 6 months? Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed dam of her composure finally breaking. "Don't reduce her to that." He snapped, a flash of anger in his eyes. He was defending her. Already. "You don't know her. You don't know us." "I know you, Julian," she whispered, tears now streaming down her face, hot and furious. "Or at least I thought I did. The man I knew wouldn't do this. He wouldn't be this cruel." He stood up from the table, scraping his chair back against the hardwood floor. The sound was violent, grating. He tossed his napkin onto his barely touched plate of food, a final act of dismissal. A dismissal of the meal, of her, of their entire life together. "I've already packed a bag. I'll be staying at a hotel until we can sort things out with the lawyers," he said, his voice now brisk and businesslike. He was already detaching, already moving on. "My lawyer, Robert Peterson, will be in touch with you tomorrow to discuss the arrangements." He walked out of the dining room without a backward glance. Sophia sat there frozen, listening to his footsteps on the stairs, the zip of a suitcase, the click of the front door closing. The silence that descended was absolute, a heavy shroud smothering the last vestiges of her life as she knew it. She looked at the 2 plates of food, the 2 glasses of wine, the 2 empty chairs. A perfect portrait of a partnership now irrevocably shattered. The Last Supper was over, and she had eaten it alone. The days that followed the front door clicking shut were a blur of gray monotony punctuated by sharp, stabbing pains of memory. Every corner of the house held a ghost. The indentation on Julian's side of the bed, the coffee mug he favored still in the dish rack, the faint scent of his cologne on the collar of a blazer left behind in the closet, each was a small torture. Sophia moved through her home like a wraith, the vibrant colors of her life bleached out, leaving only the stark skeletal framework of her heartbreak. Julian's lawyer, Robert Peterson, was as cold and efficient as his client. The initial letter arrived on thick cream-colored letterhead, its polite, sterile language outlining Julian's intentions with brutal clarity. He wanted a swift, uncomplicated divorce. He was offering a settlement that was, in Peterson's words, more than generous. To Sophia, it felt like an insult. He was trying to buy her silence, to put a price on 15 years of her life, her love, her sacrifices. She hired her own lawyer, a kind but firm woman named Eleanor Vance. The shared surname was a bitter irony not lost on Sophia, who warned her that Julian was playing hardball. He wants to be free, Sophia, and he wants to do it as cleanly and cheaply as possible. Eleanor had explained, her eyes full of a weary sympathy that spoke of countless similar cases. He's claiming that your lack of contribution to his career in recent years means the lion's share of the assets, including his firm partnership, are his alone. The accusation was a knife to the gut. The countless nights she'd spent hosting his colleagues and clients, charming them with her intelligence and grace. The years she'd managed their finances with meticulous care, allowing him the freedom to take professional risks. The unwavering emotional support that had been the bedrock of his ambition. All of it was now reframed as a lack of contribution. The true cruelty, however, came not from the lawyers, but from the digital world. A week after he left, Chloe Summers's social media profile, once private, suddenly became public. It was a calculated move, a digital victory lap. There they were, Julian and Chloe clinking champagne glasses on a rooftop bar, the city lights twinkling behind them like 1,000 tiny applauses for their betrayal. There was a picture of them on a weekend getaway to Nantucket. Julian's arm wrapped possessively around her, a genuine, unguarded smile on his face that Sophia hadn't seen in years. The caption read, "Finally found a man who isn't afraid of a little adventure." New beginnings. Love. Each post was a fresh wave of humiliation. Their shared friends, the couples they'd vacationed with and celebrated milestones with, were forced to choose sides. Most offered Sophia weak, pitying condolences before quietly unfollowing her, their allegiance shifting to the new shiny couple. Julian and Chloe were exciting. Sophia was a tragedy, a reminder of what could go wrong, and no one wanted that kind of unpleasantness on their social feed. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 6 agonizing months. Julian fought her on everything. He argued that the Victorian house, their dream home, should be sold immediately so he could access his equity to invest in his future. He contested her right to any portion of his pension. His cruelty was methodical. He was dismantling their shared past brick by brick, ensuring nothing was left for her to cling to. One afternoon, sorting through boxes in the attic, she found a portfolio of her old work from graduate school. It was filled with her research on the Florentine Renaissance, detailed analyses of obscure Baroque painters, and a half-finished thesis on the use of light in Caravaggio's work. She ran her fingers over the pages, the crisp paper a tangible link to a version of herself she had almost forgotten, a woman who was passionate, intelligent, and had a future of her own. A wave of profound loss washed over her, a grief not just for her marriage, but for the person she had allowed herself to stop being. The final court date arrived on a bleak November day. Sophia sat on one side of the sterile courtroom with Eleanor while Julian and Chloe sat on the other. Chloe was dressed in a sharp-tailored suit, her hand resting proprietorially on Julian's arm. She looked every bit the young, successful woman who had gotten everything she wanted. Julian refused to meet Sophia's eyes. The judge, a stern-faced man who had seen it all, finalized the decree. The house was to be sold. Sophia was awarded a settlement that was a fraction of what she deserved, enough to live on for a year or two if she was frugal, but not enough to rebuild a life. She was granted alimony for only 3 years, the judge agreeing with Peterson's argument that she was perfectly capable of re-entering the workforce. At 42, with a 15-year gap in her resume, the prospect felt like being asked to scale a sheer cliff face with no ropes. As they filed out of the courtroom, Julian finally stopped in front of her. Chloe stood a few feet away, watching them with a smug, triumphant smirk. "Sophia, He began, his voice faltering for the first time. Perhaps a flicker of guilt had finally penetrated his armor of self-justification. "I hope you can land on your feet. For what it's worth, I am sorry for the pain this has caused." It was the most pathetic absolution a man could offer. It wasn't an apology for his actions, only for her reaction to them. The condescension in his tone, the pity in his eyes, was the final indignity. Something inside Sophia, something that had been dormant for years, finally snapped. The grief and the helplessness receded, replaced by a cold, clear stream of anger. "Don't you dare pity me, Julian," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of the tears he was likely expecting. "You didn't just cause me pain. You built your new life on the architecture of our ruin. You bulldozed 15 years of loyalty and love to build a monument to your own ego. Pity is for victims. I am not your victim. I am a survivor of your choices. And you will live with them." She turned and walked away, her back straight, leaving him standing there for the first time, looking utterly speechless. Chloe's smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. As Sophia walked out of the courthouse and into the cold, unforgiving city, she didn't feel defeated. She felt empty. But it was the emptiness of a cleared foundation, not a crater, an emptiness on which something new could eventually be built. The first step was leaving Boston and the ghosts it held behind for good. New York City was a brutal and indifferent balm. It didn't care about her heartbreak. Its relentless energy demanded her full attention, leaving little room for wallowing. Sophia sold the Victorian house in Boston, the closing a somber affair that felt like a funeral. With the meager proceeds from the sale and her settlement, she rented a small one-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village, a neighborhood whose vibrant art scene felt like a tentative step back toward her old self. For the first few months, survival was the only goal. The city was overwhelmingly expensive, and the ghosts of her past life were replaced by the very real specter of financial ruin. The alimony felt less like a safety net and more like a ticking clock. She sent out dozens of resumes for curator positions at major museums, the Guggenheim, the Met, MoMA, but her 15-year employment gap was a glaring red flag. The rejection emails, when they came at all, were polite but firm. She was an artifact from another era in a field that was rapidly modernizing. Her best friend from college, Isabel, who worked in finance, was her lifeline. "Don't aim for the top right away," Soph Isabel advised over coffee one afternoon. "Get your foot in the door. Any door. Show them what you can do. Your passion hasn't expired, even if your resume has." Taking Isabel's advice, Sophia lowered her sights. She found a listing for an assistant archivist and researcher position at the Beaumont Gallery, a small but highly respected private gallery in Chelsea, known for its collection of post-war European masters. It was a glorified administrative role, a world away from the senior curator position she'd once been on track for. The pay was abysmal. But it was a door. The gallery's owner, a formidable woman named Genevieve Beaumont, interviewed Sophia herself. Genevieve was in her late 70s with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed professional facade Sophia had erected. "Your academic credentials are a decade and a half old." "Mrs. Reynolds," Genevieve said, her tone sharp but not unkind as she peered over her spectacles at Sophia's resume. "Why this job? This is grunt work. Cataloging research for acquisitions, handling provenance paperwork. It's not glamorous." "I'm aware," Sophia replied, her voice steady. "But I love the work. I've followed your gallery for years. Your acquisition of the early Gerhard Richter series was inspired. You saw the value before the market did. I want to be in a place that values the art over the hype. I'm not afraid of grunt work. I just want to be near the art again." Something in her honest, unvarnished answer seemed to resonate with the older woman. Genevieve hired her on a 3-month probationary basis. The work was exactly as described: tedious, meticulous, and largely invisible. Sophia spent her days in the gallery's chilly basement archive, surrounded by stacks of auction catalogs, artist biographies, and dusty provenance files. She cross-referenced sales records, digitized old slides, and wrote dry, factual descriptions for the gallery's online database. Yet to her surprise, she felt a flicker of her old self returning. In the quiet solitude of the archives, surrounded by the stories of art and artists, she began to feel grounded. She was no longer just Julian's ex-wife. She was Sophia Reynolds' art historian. It was during her second month that she first noticed him. He was a regular visitor to the gallery, but he wasn't like the other wealthy collectors who strode in with an air of entitlement, loudly discussing their portfolios. This man was different. He was tall and impeccably dressed in quiet, expensive suits, but he moved with an unassuming grace. He never spoke to the sales staff. He would simply enter, nod politely to the front desk, and spend an hour or two in silent contemplation of the artwork. He favored the more challenging, less commercial pieces, studying them with an intensity that fascinated Sophia. She learned from her colleagues that his name was Marcus Thorne. No one knew much about him other than that he was a significant, though intensely private, client. He purchased pieces occasionally, always through a discreet art consultant, never in person. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Sophia was upstairs in the main gallery helping to hang a new exhibition of Italian arte povera. She was on a ladder adjusting the lighting on a piece by Ioannis Kounellis when she heard a quiet voice from below. The interplay between the steel plate and the burlap sack is fascinating. One industrial and cold, the other organic and warm. A commentary on nature versus manufacturing. Sophia nearly lost her balance. She looked down to see Marcus Thorne standing there, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the artwork. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, more thinking aloud. I always thought, Sophia found herself saying, her voice a little shaky from her perch on the ladder, that Kounellis was using the materials to explore a sort of modern-day alchemy, trying to transform mundane, poor materials into something with poetic, almost spiritual weight. He looked up at her, and his eyes, a deep shade of gray, registered a flicker of surprise and then genuine interest. That's a much better way of putting it. An alchemy of the ordinary. I like that. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't seem to care that she was just a staff member on a ladder. He was interested in her thought. "You have a good eye," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. "I'm just an archivist," she replied, climbing down the ladder and wiping her dusty hands on her trousers. "An archivist with a curator's insight," he corrected gently. He gave her a small, polite smile, nodded once more at the Kounellis piece, and then turned and walked out of the gallery as quietly as he had entered. The interaction was brief, lasting no more than 2 minutes, but it stayed with Sophia for the rest of the day. It was the first time in years that a stranger, had seen her for her mind. He hadn't seen a jilted wife, a middle-aged woman starting over, or a low-level employee. He had seen her intellect. It was a small thing, a tiny seed of validation, but in the barren soil of her confidence, it felt like the beginning of a spring. For the first time since Julian had uttered those 5 fateful words, Sophia felt a genuine, unforced smile touch her lips. The seed of confidence planted by that brief encounter with Marcus Thorne began to sprout. Sophia poured her renewed energy into her work at the Beaumont Gallery with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just cataloging anymore. She was connecting dots, finding narratives hidden within the dusty archives. While researching the provenance of a minor painting by the French abstractionist Jean Fautrier, she uncovered a series of letters that suggested the painting was part of a lost triptych separated during the chaos of World War II. She spent weeks of her own time long after the gallery had closed cross-referencing shipping manifests and old family journals in digital archives across Europe. Her research was a masterclass in art historical detective work. Finally, she traced the other 2 pieces, one in a private collection in Zurich, the other misattributed in the storage vaults of a small museum in Brussels. She compiled her findings into a detailed 50-page report, and with trembling hands left it on Genevieve Beaumont's desk. She didn't know if she was overstepping her bounds, if the owner of the gallery would be annoyed by the initiative of a mere archivist. 2 days later, Genevieve called her into her office. The report was on the desk, covered in handwritten notes. "This," Genevieve said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the cover page, "is the most brilliant piece of provenance research I have seen in 20 years. "How did you do this?" Sophia explained her process, her voice gaining confidence as she detailed the trail of clues. Genevieve listened intently, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. "I underestimated you, Mrs. Reynolds," Genevieve said when she was finished. "Effective immediately, your title is Head of Research and Archives. Your salary will be tripled. You will report directly to me. Your first project is to lead our efforts to acquire the other 2 Fautrier pieces and reunite the triptych. I want it as the centerpiece for our spring exhibition." Sophia was stunned. It was more than a promotion. It was a resurrection. The validation was so overwhelming she felt lightheaded. She had done this, on her own. Her mind, her skills, the very things Julian had implicitly devalued were now her greatest assets. Meanwhile, in Boston, Julian Vance's life was trending in the opposite direction. The thrill of his new relationship with Chloe had begun to curdle into a grim reality. Chloe's ambition was matched only by her expensive tastes. She wanted the penthouse apartment, the European sports car, the designer wardrobe. Julian, whose income was respectable but not stratospheric, found himself increasingly stretched thin. He had leveraged his share of the house sale on a risky real estate investment Chloe had pushed for, which was now underperforming. The generous settlement he'd resented giving Sophia now seemed like a pittance compared to Chloe's monthly credit card bills. Their relationship, once fueled by the illicit thrill of their affair, was now transactional. Their arguments were frequent and bitter, often about money. Chloe saw his financial struggles not as a shared problem, but as his personal failure. The possibilities and horizons he had once rhapsodized about now looked like a mountain of debt, and a partner who saw him as a means to an end. At work, his focus was shot. A major project he was leading came in over budget and behind schedule, earning him a stern reprimand from the senior partners. The brilliant rule-breaking man Chloe had supposedly fallen for was being ground down by the very life he had chosen. Back in New York, Sophia's life was blossoming. Her success with the Fautrier triptych sent ripples through the art world. The Beaumont Gallery's spring exhibition was a massive success, lauded in art journals and profiled in the New York Times. Sophia's name was mentioned as the brilliant researcher behind the discovery. Marcus Thorne began visiting the gallery more frequently. Their conversations, once rare, became a regular occurrence. He would seek her out ostensibly to ask a question about a particular piece, but their discussions would invariably drift to art theory, history, and philosophy. She learned that he was the founder and CEO of a hugely successful data analytics firm, Thorne Industries, but he spoke of his work with a detached air. His true passion was art. He was drawn to her deep, unpretentious knowledge and the quiet fire that lit up her eyes when she spoke about something she loved. She, in turn, was drawn to his incisive mind, his gentle demeanor, and the way he listened, truly listened to her ideas. There was an easy rapport between them, a meeting of minds that felt both exhilarating and deeply comforting. He never once asked about her past or her divorce. He was interested only in the woman standing before him. One evening, after a particularly engaging conversation about the sublime in the work of Mark Rothko, he hesitated at the gallery door. "Sophia," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I know this is forward, but there's a private concert at Carnegie Hall on Saturday. A performance of Beethoven's late string quartets. I have a box. Would you do me the honor of joining me?" Sophia's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a business proposition or a casual coffee. It was a date. A real one. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. "I would love that, Marcus," she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. That Saturday, as she sat beside him in the velvet-lined box at Carnegie Hall, listening to the achingly beautiful and complex music, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. Marcus didn't try to impress her with his wealth or status. They simply shared the experience, their shoulders occasionally brushing a silent communication passing between them. After the concert, he walked her back to her apartment building. Under the soft glow of the streetlights, he turned to her. "I haven't enjoyed an evening this much in a very long time, Sophia," he said, his gray eyes soft. "Neither have I," she confessed. He didn't lean in for a kiss. Instead, he gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Good night, Sophia." As she rode the elevator up to her small apartment, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her life was no longer defined by what she had lost. Julian had tried to convince her she was a garden left to go to seed, predictable and overgrown. But he was wrong. She wasn't overgrown. She was fallow. And in the heart of New York, away from the poison of his judgment, she was finally gloriously beginning to bloom again. The next year was a whirlwind of success and happiness that Sophia could never have imagined in the dark days following her divorce. Her role at the Beaumont Gallery expanded, and Genevieve began grooming her as a successor, taking her on acquisition trips to London, Paris, and Hong Kong. Sophia proved to have an uncanny instinct for the market, an academic's rigor, combined with a newly discovered business acumen. She was respected, admired, and financially independent for the first time in her adult life. Her relationship with Marcus deepened into a profound and loving partnership. It was a love built not on desperate need or youthful infatuation, but on a foundation of mutual respect, shared passions, and quiet understanding. He was her biggest champion, celebrating her professional triumphs with quiet pride. She in turn provided him with a sanctuary from the high-pressure world he inhabited, a space where he could be himself, not the titan of industry the world saw. He wasn't trying to recapture his youth or find a trophy. He was a man who had found his equal. 6 months into their relationship, he had taken her to a small, secluded beach in the Hamptons at sunset. There, with no fanfare or pretense, he told her he loved her and asked her to be his wife. He presented her not with a gaudy diamond, but with a simple, elegant ring featuring a rare cornflower blue sapphire the color of Genevieve Beaumont's eyes, a subtle nod to the place where their lives had first intersected. Sophia's yes was immediate and joyous. They decided to make their first official public appearance as an engaged couple at the annual Metropolitan Museum of Art's Conservation Gala, the most exclusive and high-profile philanthropic event in New York City. It was an evening where titans of finance, tech moguls, celebrities, and art world luminaries converged. For the event, Marcus had commissioned a gown for her from a famous designer. It was a masterpiece of deep emerald silk that shimmered under the light, cut in a classic, elegant style that highlighted her grace and confidence. A simple but breathtaking necklace of diamonds, a gift from Marcus, rested at her collarbone. As she looked at her reflection before they left their shared Fifth Avenue penthouse, a home filled with light art and laughter, she saw not a shadow of the heartbroken woman from Boston. She saw a woman who was powerful, radiant, and deeply loved. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked, coming up behind her. He was impossibly handsome in a bespoke tuxedo. He wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder, as they looked at their reflections together. "I am," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that resonated to her core. Their arrival at the Met was an event in itself. As they stepped out of the black town car, a flurry of camera flashes erupted. The name Marcus Thorne was whispered through the crowd of paparazzi, but the real question on everyone's lips was, who is the woman with him? She was a mystery, an elegant and unknown quantity on the arm of one of the world's most private billionaires. Sophia held her head high, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of Marcus's arm, utterly unfazed by the attention. Inside the gala was a dazzling spectacle of power and wealth. The great hall of the museum was filled with couture gowns, glittering jewels, and the confident hum of the global elite. Sophia, who had once felt her world shrink to the size of a suburban Victorian, now moved through this rarefied air with an easy grace. She wasn't intimidated. After all, she knew more about the art hanging on the walls around them than 99% of the people in the room. She wasn't just a billionaire's fiancée. She had earned her place here. They mingled, Marcus introducing her to senators, tech entrepreneurs, and celebrated artists. She spoke intelligently and charmingly, her expertise on art serving as a natural bridge in conversations. She wasn't just a beautiful accessory, she was a captivating presence in her own right, and Marcus watched her with undisguised adoration. This was her unveiling. Not just as Marcus Thorne's future wife, but as Sophia Reynolds, a woman reborn. The shame and humiliation Julian had inflicted upon her felt like a distant memory from someone else's life. She had not only survived, she had triumphed, building a life far grander and more fulfilling than the one that had been stolen from her. And as the orchestra began to play, and the dinner chimes rang, she had no idea that her past and present were about to collide in the most dramatic way imaginable. Julian Vance felt like an imposter. He stood near a massive floral arrangement, nursing a glass of overpriced champagne, the tuxedo he'd rented feeling tight and restrictive. Sterling and Vance Architects had purchased a single table at the Met Gala, a desperate, expensive attempt to network and stay relevant in a changing market. The firm was struggling, and so was Julian. His partnership dividends had been slashed, and his relationship with Chloe was a constant draining war of attrition. She was here tonight, currently across the room, laughing a little too loudly with a younger real estate developer. Chloe had insisted they attend. To her, this evening wasn't about business. It was about being seen. It was about populating her Instagram feed with proof that she had arrived. She wore a garish, bright fuchsia dress that was more expensive than Julian's monthly mortgage payment on the cramped condo they now shared. He watched her, and for the first time he felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. The vibrant, exciting woman he had left his life for had revealed herself to be a shallow, demanding mannequin interested only in the status he could provide, a status that was rapidly diminishing. He scanned the cavernous hall, a sea of faces he didn't know, feeling a profound sense of alienation. His life in Boston, the respect of his peers, the quiet comfort of his home, he had torched it all for this. For a rented suit and a partner who looked at him with perpetual disappointment. A bitter regret, an emotion he had long suppressed, began to rise in his throat like bile. And then he saw her. Across the room, bathed in the soft golden light of a chandelier, stood a woman in an emerald silk gown. She was laughing, her head tilted back slightly, a cascade of diamonds glittering at her throat. There was something familiar about her posture, the elegant line of her neck. As she turned her head, her profile came into view, and the champagne glass in Julian's hand trembled. It was Sophia. But it wasn't the Sophia he knew. It wasn't the quiet, unassuming wife in sensible cardigans he had left behind. This woman was luminous. She radiated a confidence and poise that was breathtaking. She was captivating. He watched, mesmerized, as the man beside her, a tall, distinguished figure, leaned in and whispered something in her ear, his touch on the small of her back both gentle and possessive. The man was Marcus Thorne. Even Julian, in his diminished world, knew who Marcus Thorne was, a legend in the tech world, a genuine billionaire, a man whose influence quietly shaped global markets. The blood drained from Julian's face. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The cacophony of the gala, the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses faded into a dull roaring static in his ears. It was as if the world had suddenly switched to slow motion. Sophia, his Sophia. The woman he had discarded as boring and predictable was standing there on the arm of Marcus Thorne, looking like she owned the very room he felt so out of place in. He felt a primal, illogical surge of possessiveness. What is she doing with him? The absurdity of the question didn't even register. He had to talk to her. He had to understand. He started moving through the crowd, his movements clumsy, jostling a waiter, and ignoring the annoyed glances he received. He reached them just as Marcus was being pulled away by a colleague. Sophia was left standing alone for a moment, observing a nearby Rodin sculpture. This was his chance. "Sophia," he said, his voice coming out as a hoarse croak. She turned slowly, her expression one of polite neutrality. the kind one reserves for a stranger asking for directions. Then her eyes focused on him, and a flicker of recognition appeared, followed by nothing. No anger, no sadness, no shock. Just a cool, placid calm. It was 1,000 times more devastating than any outburst would have been. "Julian," she said, her voice even and smooth. "What a surprise to see you here. Sophia, you look—" He fumbled for words, his mind blanking. "Incredible." "Thank you," she said simply, her gaze already starting to drift away as if looking for someone more interesting. "I don't understand," he blurted out, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "You're with Marcus Thorne." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "We're engaged, actually." Engaged. The word hit him like a physical punch. He had envisioned her life after him as a sad, lonely affair. Maybe she'd have gotten a quiet job at a library. Maybe she'd be living in a small apartment regretting the life she'd lost. This reality, this glorious, triumphant reality, was something his ego could not process. But how he stammered like a fool. "I went back to work," she said, her tone carrying a hint of amusement. "I remembered who I was before I dedicated 15 years of my life to supporting your career. It turns out I'm quite good at it." Just then Chloe arrived, her fuchsia dress an assault on the eyes. "Julian, there you are. Who is this?" she asked, looking Sophia up and down with a dismissive air. Before Julian could answer, Sophia's eyes met Chloe's. The cool calm remained, but now it was edged with steel. She didn't acknowledge Chloe's question. She simply looked at her, then back at Julian, a silent, damning assessment of the choice he had made. In that single glance, she made Chloe look cheap, loud, and utterly insignificant. Marcus returned to her side, his presence alone, a force field of power and influence. He slipped his arm around Sophia's waist, his eyes glancing at Julian with polite disinterest. "Everything all right, my love?" he asked Sophia, his voice a low rumble of concern. "Perfectly," Sophia replied, turning her back on Julian and Chloe completely. She placed a hand on Marcus's chest. "Darling, I was just telling an old acquaintance from Boston how lovely the evening is." An old acquaintance. The words were a final, brutal severance. He wasn't her ex-husband, the man who had shared her bed for 15 years. He was just a footnote from a past she had moved on from. As Sophia and Marcus walked away, blending seamlessly back into the glittering crowd, Julian stood frozen in place. Chloe started complaining beside him, her voice a shrill, annoying buzz. He didn't hear her. He was watching Sophia. He was watching the masterpiece he had thrown away, the woman he had been too blind and too arrogant to see. He had traded a priceless work of art for a cheap, flashy print. And he was left standing there, a mannequin among men, hollowed out by the crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake. The months following the Met Gala were a slow, agonizing unraveling for Julian Vance. The image of Sophia, radiant and untouchable, on the arm of Marcus Thorne was seared into his memory. It became the backdrop to every failure, every argument, every new disappointment. It was the ghost at the feast of his miserable life. The encounter had a profound effect on Chloe as well. Seeing Sophia so clearly inhabiting a world of wealth and class that Chloe could only aspire to broke something in her. The man she had attached herself to was revealed not as a stepping stone but as a sinking one. Her contempt for Julian, once a simmering undertone, became open and venomous. She mocked his declining income, his lack of connections, his failure to be the powerful man she thought he was. Their fights escalated, the thin veneer of passion stripped away to reveal the ugly transactional core of their relationship. The end came 6 months after the gala, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Julian came home to their condo to find Chloe's closets empty and a note on the kitchen counter. She had left him for the real estate developer she had been talking to at the gala. The note didn't even say goodbye. It was just a list of things she considered hers that she would be sending movers for. Professionally, Julian's world was also crumbling. His lack of focus and souring demeanor had not gone unnoticed at the firm. When a new round of layoffs was announced, his name was at the top of the list. At 48 years old, Julian Vance, once a promising senior architect, was unemployed, deeply in debt, and utterly alone. He was forced to sell the condo at a loss and move into a small, characterless apartment on the outskirts of the city. He was a man adrift, haunted by the echoes of a life he had single-handedly destroyed. Sophia's life, by contrast, continued its spectacular ascent. She and Marcus were married in a small private ceremony at their estate in Tuscany, surrounded by a close circle of friends and family. Genevieve Beaumont, frail but beaming, was her matron of honor. Sophia, in a simple but exquisitely tailored white dress, looked breathtakingly happy. Her career soared. With Marcus's backing and her own sharp intellect, she left the Beaumont Gallery to start the Reynolds Thorne Foundation for the Arts, a philanthropic organization dedicated to funding emerging artists and repatriating stolen works of art. She became one of the most respected and influential figures in the art world, not because she was a billionaire's bride, but because of her genuine passion, deep knowledge, and unwavering integrity. She traveled the world, spoke at conferences, and curated exhibitions that were celebrated for their vision and intelligence. She had found not just a new life, but her true calling. She rarely thought of Julian. When she did, it was with a distant, detached pity. He was a chapter from a book she had finished long ago. Her anger had dissipated, leaving behind only the quiet wisdom that sometimes the most painful endings are the doorways to the most beautiful beginnings. Her life with Marcus was one of true partnership. They challenged each other, supported each other, and built a shared world rich with love, art, and purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 5 years after he had left her, Julian was walking through downtown Boston. He was on his way to an interview for a low-level drafting position at a small, uninspired firm, the only interview he'd been able to get in months. As he passed a high-end newsstand, his eyes were drawn to the cover of a magazine. It was Forbes, and on the cover was Sophia. She was standing in front of a stunning sculpture, her expression confident and serene. The headline read, "Sophia Reynolds, the new face of art philanthropy. How the Billionaire's Bride is changing the world, one masterpiece at a time." Julian stopped dead on the sidewalk, the city's hustle and bustle fading away. He stared at the photograph, at the woman he had called boring, unadventurous, and predictable. He had traded her for a fleeting thrill for a younger model, believing he was upgrading his life. He had been so obsessed with the superficial currency of youth and excitement that he had failed to see the true immeasurable value of the woman beside him, her loyalty, her brilliance, her quiet strength. He had cashed in a fortune for a handful of trinkets. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the best part of himself. His punishment wasn't poverty or loneliness. It was the crushing eternal knowledge of what he had thrown away and the understanding that he would spend the rest of his life as a forgotten footnote in the magnificent story of hers. He bought the magazine, and as he walked to his dead-end interview, he began to read about the incredible world she had built, a world he had once been invited to share, but had been too much of a fool to appreciate. In the end, this isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about value. Julian Vance saw his wife's worth in terms of what she did for him, and when he thought he could get more elsewhere, he left. He never understood that Sophia's true value was not in her role as a wife, but in the incredible person she was. When she was finally free of his judgment, she was able to invest in herself, and her worth grew beyond anything he could have ever imagined. It's a powerful reminder that our value isn't determined by who we are to someone else, but by who we are to ourselves. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what you're truly made of. What did you think of Sophia's incredible transformation? Have you ever seen someone turn a devastating setback into their greatest victory? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were moved by this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of trial and triumph. Thank you for listening. Thank you for